Hello, everybody. Hello and welcome. My name's Steve Sanderson. I'm a program manager on the ASP NET team at Microsoft. I'm from England, as you can probably tell, and I just started working at Microsoft about 5 months ago or something, last November. And so what I'm here to talk about to you today is a JavaScript library called Knockout JS. I'll explain what this is about, what problem it's supposed to solve in a minute, but just before we do, let me give you sort of like rundown of the synopsis of what it is, how it's structured. So it's an open source library. It's not something that's come out of Microsoft. It's a project that I started about a year ago, and now it's got a pretty good community around it. So, you know, it's got an active forum. If you post there, you'll probably get an answer in a couple of hours or something like that. It's got plenty of people writing their own plugins and such like. So it's a good community around this project right now, but it's not come out of Microsoft. It's just a JavaScript library, so it will work really well with ASP NET, whether you're talking about MVC or web forms or whatever else. And, of course, it will work with other server-side technologies like Rails or whatever you like, if that's what the sort of thing that you like. OK, so you can go to the website there and find out more about it. But what problem are we trying to solve with this library? OK, well, the problem we're trying to solve is that rich client-side user interfaces are too complicated to do. Even when you're using something nice like jQuery, jQuery is great for giving you a good API for manipulating the DOM, but it doesn't kind of solve the problem of how you structure your code in order to keep it clean, even as you're making it sophisticated and adding lots of behaviors. So Knockout comes in, and it gives you a way of using the MVVM, Model View View Model pattern, in the browser, the same pattern that you would use with Silverlight, except that it's running in JavaScript and working against DOM elements in the browser. And this means that we don't have a big complicated mess of event handlers. If we're adding lots of behaviors, we can define them declaratively, and then all these behaviors will compose together nicely, and we don't have to have lots and lots of interrelated event handlers that we have to try and track. But the best way for you to understand this is just to let me show you, so that's what I'm going to do. And of course, like any good JavaScript library, it's got to have pretty wide browser support, and that means, in our case, going back as far as IE6, Firefox 2, and then obviously newer versions of everything. And it works fine on phones, so you know you can pretty much deploy it wherever you feel like. So it's going to work out OK. Now, that, I think, is enough for slides, because the best way for me to show you this is to actually show you this. So I'm going to switch over into Visual Studio and start building a little screen here. I want to make myself a nice rich editor for some data, and then we'll talk about how we can get it onto the server and how all this MVVM thing sort of fits together. So I've got my MVC application here, and I've referenced the Knockout library, and I'm just going to start putting in some code. So I'm going to start by declaring a view model for myself, and I can put some properties on there. And let's say I want to have information about a person. Like, it's kind of obvious. So we'll have a first name property, and I'll call the person Bert for now. Why not? And then I want to tell Knockout to use this view model. So I say apply bindings, which might seem a little bit of an odd thing to say, but it will become clearer why we call it that in a minute. And now I want to actually display some properties from my view model into the user interface. So I can start writing some regular HTML. So let's say first name. And then I'll put a span element. And now I can use this data bind attribute, which is something that Knockout gives you, and that's how we can link our DOM elements to our view model. And in this case, I want to link the text on this element to the first name property on my view model. And if I do that, then if I bring this up in a browser, and I'll hit refresh there, and hopefully we'll see that indeed that DOM element now does have the text from our view model on it. All right? So this is the basic bindings thing, like you could do in Silverlight. But now let's say I want to have multiple DOM elements that are all bound to the same data. And in fact, I'm going to have an input element so we can edit this data. And I want to bind the value on my text box to this first name property. So if I do that, then I will come over and reload that. Now you see I've got a text box as well, and they're both bound to the same data. And if I start editing this, then nothing seems to happen. Well, actually, something has happened here. When I edited this text box, because this is a two-way binding, it updated the first name property on my view model. But because it's just a string, nobody knows that it's changed. Like, the string doesn't know to notify anybody. So Knockout has this concept of observables. And if I declare that this property is observable, like that, then if I was to reload, then this time, when I start editing the text box, you'll see the two-way binding thing has really worked. So my span starts updating in sync with my data. And of course, I can have multiple properties as well. So let's say I want to have a last name like this, and Bart Bert Smith, okay. And then I want to, let's say, duplicate all of this stuff, and I'll have last name elements here, just the same as what we had for first name, last name, and last name. Then this is going to do exactly what you expect, in that I've now got two independently observable bits of data. So as one thing changes, or everything else that's observing that data will update. But what if I want to combine multiple bits of observable data, right? So what if I want to display the person's full name? I want to somehow join the first name and last name into something that updates in synchronization with all the underlying data there. So there's this other concept in Knockout called a dependent observable. It's a bit of a confusing sounding name, but it's not too bad. So I want to define a full name property on my view model, and I'll say it's a dependent observable. And what that means is that it's observable in the same way that an observable is observable, in that when it changes, people get notified. But it depends on other observables, and I can use an arbitrary JavaScript function to define the value of my dependent observable. So I can say, I want to get this dot first name, and I'll put a space, and then I'll have this dot last name. All right? And you'll see that I'm calling these properties as if they were functions, and by doing that, I read the latest value out. So now I've got this, I can do the obvious thing of just displaying the full name value. So I'm going to grab the two text boxes for the first name and last name, and then below that I'm going to display the full name like this. So I'll have the text of full name there. All right, so hopefully you'll be able to guess what's going to happen now. I've got Bert Smith as the full name, and when I edit either part of the data, the full name gets updated. And so this is Knockout doing its dependency tracking thing. It knows that full name depends on both first name and last name, so when either of those changes, the change propagates through the object graph and is flushed out into the user interface, and so everything updates in sync with the underlying data model. So that's nice, but let's move on into some slightly more sophisticated user interface things and start thinking about how we can mutate the DOM and add and remove elements dynamically. And specifically, I'll be talking about templating now. So when you want to generate blocks of HTML, often the way you want to do it is through a template, because it's a nice, clean way of defining the markup that you want to come out. So let's say I want to track the list of friends that our person has got. So since this is a nice, clean, modern application, I'm going to do it in an object-oriented JavaScript way. So I want a class that represents a friend. And what you may or may not know about JavaScript is that any function can act as a constructor for a class. So I'm going to have this friend constructor, and it's going to take a name, and then from that I will return a new object that has a name property, and the value of that will be observable, and the initial value will be the name that's been passed into my constructor. So now I've got that, let's define an array of friends on the view model, friends, and I'm going to make this not just a regular JavaScript array, but a Knockout observable array. So it's just like an array, except that it's observable. So when you mutate its state, when you add and remove elements, people get notified that you've modified it. So the initial value, I'll put in a new friend for a Bert, and that can be Steve, and let's have another new friend, let's have Annie. All right, so Bert's got some friends now, and we want to render this data by means of a template. So Knockout supports, well, it's got pluggable templates engine in support, but by default it works with jQuery templates. That's the most popular one. So that's what I'm going to use now. I'm going to define a bit more markup, and I will have friends. And to render a template, I can use a binding called template. And all I have to do is give the name of my template. So I'll have friends template, like that. And now that's going to look for and render a template with this name. So I have to define the template, and the syntax for doing that in jQuery templates is to have a script block whose ID is that name. And because this is not actually any executable script, I have to give it a type attribute which is not JavaScript. So I'll have text HTML, just so the browser doesn't try to execute it. And now I can put some markup that I want to come out of my template. So I'm going to have an unordered list, and I want to iterate over all of the friends. So the syntax in jQuery templates is like this. I have index and friend. So these are the iteration variables, and I want to do this for each item in the friends observable array. Each. Okay. And for each one of these things, I want to render a list item, and then I will render the name of the friend. Okay. So hopefully, actually I want the friend.name, don't I? Because that's the iteration value. All right, so hopefully that's going to render this template for me. Let's see what happens. And there we go, it does. So my data has been transformed into some nice HTML, and that's great. And now let's make this editable. So let's say we want to add and remove elements from our array. So I want to have a button that does adding a new item. So I will stick this down here just for convenience. And I'll say add friend. And I want to bind this. So I'm going to bind the click event on this element to a function. I'll call it add friend, why not? Like that. And now I can define a function on my view model that's going to handle this click. So I've bound that button's click to this following function, which I'll just define. So function, and then I will say this dot friends dot push. That's how in JavaScript you add an element to an array. And I'll put a new friend there, and I'll have it another friend. Why not? All right, so hopefully now, when I click my button, it's going to run the add friends, which is going to push an element into the observable array. And because it's observable and we've got the dependency tracking, it's going to know that we have to re-render this template. So I click add friend, and indeed another appears at the bottom of the list, which is nice. All right, so this is cool. But let's think about if this was really sophisticated. If we had loads and loads of elements, hundreds, thousands maybe, how would the performance be? Let's try and make sure that we're not doing too much work in the browser that would make it a slow and sluggish experience. So to appreciate what's going on, I'm going to stick a bit of extra data that comes out of my template. So I'm just going to put the date when each item was rendered, so we can observe exactly what's going on behind the scenes. So you might not be able to guess, but what that's going to do is it's going to make a date stamp appear on each row there. You can see that they were both rendered at 40 seconds. Then if I add, they were all rendered at 45. Then I add again, they were all rendered at 47. So every time I change it, it's rerunning the whole template for everything, which is not surprising because, the template itself defines this logic of iterating over the array. So, of course, it has to run the whole template and do all the iteration again. But because Knockout has got this very nice internal dependency tracking system, it can do a little better because it can actually know what has changed in your array and then only update your DOM in a kind of minimal way. So the way I can do this, instead of doing the each inside my template, I'll put Knockout in control of the iteration. And the syntax for this is I changed my template binding a little bit to say I want to render a template called friends template, but not just once. I want to render it for each of the friends. Okay? And then I want the output there not to go into a div, let's say, but into an unordered list element. Now, the only thing that I want to come out of my actual template now is the list item, because I'm going to have this once for each element in the set. And also, because we don't have this friend iteration variable anymore, I have to say data, because that's the thing that's, the thing that we're doing for each of them. All right, so now if I run this, then it still looks the same initially. But every time I add now, see the difference? So the elements that are already there are not being changed. The Knockout knows the minimal set of changes that's necessary to get our user interface up to date. So we can scale up to significantly more sophisticated user interfaces than you could with just a plain templating solution because of the way that the dependency tracking works and knows what's changing your user interface. All right. So let's move on a little bit further and try and make our user interface a touch more sophisticated. We'll get rid of that first. And I want to make this like a proper editor so that not only can I add, but I can remove and I can edit and I can set some other properties as well. So that's all going to be nice. So I want to have a way of, let's say, removing a friend. So I'm going, because of course you don't stay friends with someone forever, you've got to get rid of your friends eventually. So I'll add a button that appears that will remove, and I'll say remove. Okay, and I want to bind this, the click event on this, to a function called remove, let's say. And because I'm in the context of the friend object, I need to put I can put the remove function actually on friend itself, which means that we've got a nice way of sort of separating out all our logic into different objects, which is cool. And so to remove a friend, I can just say viewModel.friends.remove this. And we'll remove this friend. All right, that's nice. And also, I want to make the name actually editable. So I'm going to put an input element there, and I'll say data bind equals value, and I'll bind the value of my input to the name of the friend. So this shows that we can use data bind attributes inside templates themselves, which is very convenient, and Knockout will link all the events up at the right time. So now if I run this, then hopefully I've got a text box for the friend's name, so I can edit that if I want to, and I've got these remove buttons, so I can add and I can remove. And this is nice. So we're starting to get a reasonably dynamic user interface here. And we're in a good position because we've got this nice object-oriented structure for our code. We've got the view model. We've got events and functions on the view model. We've got separate classes. And I can just start adding some extra behaviors, properties, and so on. So let's say that the next thing I want to do is track which of the friends are on Twitter. And if they are on Twitter, I want to track what their Twitter name is. So I want to have a nice little checkbox here to say whether they're on Twitter and a text box for that. So I can model that by adding an extra property. I'll have one called is on Twitter. And I'll make that an observable. Initially, we'll assume that they're not. And then I'll have a Twitter name. And I will make that also observable. And we'll just leave that blank by default. So I can now bind some extra user interface to that. I will have a Twitter name input. Here we go. So get a text box and bind the value on that to Twitter name. And also, I want a checkbox to say whether they're on Twitter or not. And in HTML, we say type equals checkbox. And then I want to bind, again, use a different binding this time, the checked property of this to the is on Twitter flag. And hopefully, actually, let's wrap this up in a nice clickable label so that it's easier to click. So label, and I'll say is on Twitter, close the label. And then if I run that now, we've got the is on Twitter, and then we've got the checkbox, and we've got the text box next to it. So that's nice. But it doesn't really make sense to have this text box here if they're not on Twitter. Actually, I only want that to appear if the checkbox is checked. Now, if we're just doing this with plain jQuery, we would have a click event handler on the checkbox, and we'd add, show and hide this box, and that would be fine. But the more things you've got like that, the more stuff you have to kind of track, particularly when they're interrelated events. But because we're using the model view model pattern, we can do it in a much easier way. We can just express declaratively that this text box here is visible only if they are on Twitter, or if they is on Twitter, if you're not very good with English. And then if I run that now, then you see the boxes are not there. And as I toggle the checkbox, you can hardly see it, but it's there. Look, see, it's not there, then it's there, and it's not. So that's nice, and we've just got this expressed in one place. Of course, you could do it with templating. You could do it with like an if in the template if you wanted to make that hide and show, and that would absolutely work. But the drawback to that is that whenever you change the checkbox, we'd have to re-render the whole template at that point, and we're trying to minimize that because we want the user interface to be incredibly responsive. It might not make too much difference on the desktop, but on a mobile browser where the browser is not very fast, you want to be as efficient as you can. Okay, so that's cool. So we can now we can control we can monitor whether people are on Twitter. We've got our data, and that's all working cool. What if we wanted to add some more behaviors? Like, let's say we want to keep a track of the number of friends that our friend has got. Again, if we were just doing this plain jQuery events, we would have to track we'd have to have event handlers on the add and remove, and every time you add and remove, we need to update or decrement a counter of the number of friends, or we would need to do some sort of query to count the number of DOM elements that represent friends, and it would not be completely trivial, but with following the MVVM pattern, it is really trivial if I want to have a count. All I do is I'll just say I'll have a span element, and I will data bind the text on this span to be friend. It helps if you can type friends.length. Okay, and that's literally it. So now my span's text will be 2 when there are 2 friends, or 3 when there are 3, 2, 1. There. So it's much easier to express that behavior just there. And similarly, let's say if I wanted to have a rule that you can only have at most 5 friends, then again, it would be non-trivial if we didn't have a nice data model behind it, but we do have a nice data model, so we can just say, okay, let's make this add friend button. We'll say that that is enabled only when friends.length is less than 5. Okay? Nice, expressed in one place. And then when I add friends, 3, 4, 5, and you see it's now disabled. I can't click it anymore. But if I remove, then it becomes enabled again. Then it's disabled, then it's enabled, and so on. So it's nice that we can put our behaviors in one place declaratively. Now, what if I want to actually save this data to the server? Well, that's very straightforward, actually. Because I've got my data all as JavaScript objects there, I can convert it to JSON object notation format, and then I can send that to the server in an AJAX request. And because ASP NET MVC has got built-in model binding for JSON, it's just going to parse the data automatically. I write very little code to make this work, so I'll show you. But it's slightly too much for me to type, so this is it. I'm going to just copy and paste this in, then I'll show you. So I'm adding a new function onto my view model called save. And all that does is it's using the jQuery AJAX function to post my data to an action method on my MVC application called save, and then I'm using this ko.toJSON utility to convert my view model to just plain JSON data with no observables, and we can just send that up to the server. And then what's happening on the server? Let's have a look. So I've got a home controller which has got the save action, which is what we're calling. And you'll notice that I don't have to do anything to parse the incoming JSON data there. I'm just receiving a .NET object called person. And if we look at the definition of that, you'll see that it looks a lot like the JavaScript model that I've got. I've got a person with a first name and last name, they've got a collection of friends, and they've got all the is on Twitter properties and all that. And because the structure of my .NET objects mirrors the JSON data structure, MV3's JSON model binder can automatically just parse that data. And to show that it does, I'm generating a message based on the number of friends and whether they're on Twitter and stuff. And I'm sending that down to the client, and then on the client, I am just alerting that. So just to check that that actually works, I will create a button that is for saving, button save, and I will data bind the click on save to the save method on my model. And hopefully then, if I run my application now and I hit save, then you see I've got this message back from the server, saved Bert with whatever, so many friends, and no on Twitter. And if I was to do that with one of them on Twitter, and I was to also add a friend, then this time you see that we've got the data change. It's not fake. It really has sent the data to the server, and the server's received it, and everyone's happy. So that's pretty much the overview that I want to give you. You've seen how we can define a view model and how we can bind that to DOM elements quite cleanly, how we can express behaviors like whether buttons are enabled or not very declaratively, and how we can send it up to the server and use MVC3's JSON model binder to parse that in a really straightforward way. Obviously, if you're using a different technology, then you could receive the JSON data and deal with it in some other way. So just to close them before some questions, there are a bunch of different JavaScript libraries that try to deal with similar type scenarios like MVC on the client and that sort of thing. So what are the distinctives of Knockout? Well, I'd say there are these three things. The fact that it's doing the dependency tracking for us so that it knows how, when I change individual properties in my model, how that flushes out through the object graph. And how it knows how to change only the right parts of the DOM that actually need to be changed by that. How we've got the declarative bindings that gives us a very straightforward way of being able to see how different parts of the view model relate to different parts of the DOM, and the fact that it's designed to work with templating, and that works all fine. So if you want to go and learn some more about this, then go and have a look at the website for the project there. There's a lot of live examples that show you dealing with other scenarios like shopping carts and grids and all kinds of stuff like that. So you can go there and see examples of how the code can be used for doing different things like that. And I think that's all I want to say. So if anyone's got any questions, then go and grab a microphone and let me know what your questions are. No questions?
Hi.
Yes, hello. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I follow your question. So you're asking if we've got a JSON model, can we have observables in that model? If the object came from the server, say it was stored in a database, yeah. It came back as a request to say a JSON. Yeah. And you've got a JSON object back from the server. Yeah. Oh, yeah, okay, right. So the question is, if we've loaded some JSON data from the server that represents some existing data that's in our database, how can we kind of upgrade it into a view model with observables and things like that? Well, there's a couple of ways you can do it. One, you can just do it manually, right? You can get the JSON data and you can write a little loop that goes over it and pushes it through some constructor on the client that makes it observables. Or there's a plugin that a guy called Roy Jacobs has made, which is called knockout.mapping. And if you get that plugin, then it gives you a conventions-based way of converting a JSON blob into something with observables in it, and so you can put like callbacks and naming conventions into that so to upgrade your properties to observable and not. Is that the answer to your question? Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one. The dependent observable, it's not immediately obvious to me how because you're receiving a function to a dependent observable,
yes.
And in that example you looked at first name and last name.
Yes.
Are you parsing the code in that, like the string? How are you finding out that it's first name and last name and registering to only the first name and last name to listen for the changes?
That's a very good question. So how does this dependency tracking thing work? Like, how does it actually know that full name is related to first name and last name? Well, the reason that it works is that you'll see that the syntax for evaluating the current variable, its current value of an observable, is to call it as a function. And what Knockout does internally is that when a dependent observable is evaluating, it observes and tracks which observables were actually invoked as part of the execution and keeps a log of what things you touched. And so when the dependent observable has finished evaluating, it gets this log of what observables you talk to and then makes them a dependency. And it reevaluates that every time. So your dependent observable could even change what it depends on over time, and the subscriptions internally would all be updated to match that. And you can chain your dependent observables together and so on. It works quite nicely. Does that answer the question?
I think so. So you run that function,
yes.
And then does that mean you need to listen to every observable object in the view model first, and then you track which ones are actually called when you invoke the function?
Yeah, as part of evaluating a view model, we sort of raise an internal event to say this, as part of evaluating an observable, we raise an internal event to say this was evaluated, and then that becomes tracked and associated with the fact that this dependent observable was running at that time, so we know what was associated with that dependent observable.
Gotcha. So in the view model, at any given time, you're listening to all the observables, or just right before you evaluate a dependent observable, do you listen to all of them and then unhook, or?
Well, in terms of listening to, we don't really have to listen to them. Because observable itself is some code that's managed by Knockout, we can internally, as part of evaluating that, Knockout's code is running, so it can do that tracking without needing to sort of turn listeners on and off.
Gotcha. So each observable knows about some sort of global state, and then in Knockout?
Yeah, kind of. It's like a stack of state.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay. I think that might be all we have time for. Is that? Yeah, that is correct. So I'll have to leave it there. Come and chat with me if you've got any questions. And apart from that, have a good rest of the day. And please fill in your evaluation forms.